should begin having our fun at peace instead of war. Wouldn't it be great if we could wait when anger flares through hate, till we calm down and think more sound, common ground can be found. Peace is more fun than war. It takes less guns than war. We should begin spending our funds at peace instead of war. There is no need for fear and
That song is something. I mean, that is a real reach. I don't know, something.
Well, we're counter-programming a major event again.
Oh, are we?
For
the Stanley Cup
posterity.
Finals?
No, Israel's bombing Iran
US
tonight.
Open?
No. We did it again.
As a patriot, I only know of the Stanley Cup Finals, where an American team may soon go up 3-1 over a Canadian team, and the United States Open. So,
Well, I didn't know that was going on, but we do have some geographical diversity tonight. We might have a guest from out in hockey country, hockey land, as they say. But we'll get to him in a minute.
but beyond that, just a half dozen Caucasians having a chat like we normally do.
Well, we're well stocked with them tonight, as they say. None of these are the almost Nazis I've angered today. This much friendlier crowd that I'm used to online. But it is good to be here. Some would question the wisdom of 4 separate PCA GA preview shows, but not us. Not us.
Mr. Moderator, I rise with a point of order.
Well, you're biased, but here we are, and we had three overture preview shows. At least the O word is not really going to be uttered much tonight. We're talking about something general and timeless, which is the concept of review and control, but also the particular application of that this year. So let's introduce our guests, and we'll get into it. So we've got the notorious RFB, Ryan Beasy, pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. He was banned from the show for a good while, but he's back. And Ryan, how are you down there?
I'm doing well. When you said notorious, I thought you were talking about Jason Pyland.
Well, we'll get to him. See, you're jumping the queue here, but that's okay. So you know a few things about review and control. You can't be controlled, but you've often been reviewed. And as the clerk of a presbytery, you've got some experience with this.
I was the chairman of our review of session records committee until I was ordered to be to do penance for being.
How did that go? How did your notorious stint as chairman of that committee go, sir?
Well, they sent me to penance as clerk, and then they appointed Jonathan chairman, and then they sent him to RPR to do penance for being chairman. So it's
all right, we'll get to him. Well, we've got another bright young churchman in the PCA, Jason Pyland. Tell us where you are, Jason, and what you're doing out there.
Hey, Brad, Resby, great to be with you guys. I am up in Ohio. Believe it or not, it does exist. Ohio is real. Northeast Ohio is a wonderful place to raise a family. From the South myself, so I was a little skeptical when I moved up here. But
now, where are you from? Where are you from in the South? I don't remember.
I'm from North Carolina. I'm a North Carolina boy. Born and raised, spent 10 years in Nashville, Tennessee, and went back to North Carolina for RTS and came up to first time up north, and we've loved it.
I would submit that there are parts of Northeast Ohio which are more southern than large parts of North Carolina.
It's really interesting. Actually, there is a migration pattern in the 20th century of West Virginians moving to Akron area. So we're just north of Akron, and so it's interesting. There is some Appalachia flavor up in this area, which was much to my surprise. It's a wonderful to be around those folks who are up here.
Well, enjoy the boiled meat and potatoes buffet up there.
Absolutely. We love it. We've got some wonderful people. I'm an associate pastor at Redeemer Church up here in between Akron and Cleveland, and we are about to launch out a daughter church from Redeemer, and we're excited about that. So I'm beginning that transition from Redeemer to the church plant here over the coming months.
So will you be the pastor at the church plant?
I will be. I'll be the pastor of the church plant. It's called Western Reserve Presbyterian Church, and because this area was originally settled by Connecticut. It belonged to Connecticut. It was called the Connecticut Western Reserve, and settled by basically Puritans, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians from Connecticut. So some good Calvinist history in the area.
Is Connecticut the Ohio of the Northeast? I asked the group.
I don't know if they'd want to claim that, but sure, we can go with it.
All right, Jonathan Brooks. Have you ever been on the show before, Jonathan?
I actually was once years ago, but not as Jonathan Brooks. It was back when you were doing your Anon call-in shows.
Oh, okay. Well, I have no idea that you'd ever been on. But you are the chairman of a Review of Session Records Committee. You know a thing or two about this, and you served on the RPR committee, which is quite the job and challenge. So you're well placed to help us with this. And you've been a pastor of a small church for, is it about 3 years now?
Yeah, just over 3 years.
So these are all PCA ministers, I should say, except for Resby. He's his own thing. That's all I can say about that. But Jonathan is in my presbytery, local to me. He did not show up at my last cookout, but he said he was busy. Family stuff. He'll learn. Coach Matt Adams, you would not have skipped the cookout.
I'm always down for a good time, Brad. So no, I would not have skipped the cookout. Even contemplated driving up, but 6 to 8 hours would have been a little lengthy just to, pat our good buddy Sean Morris on the back for getting a PhD that he reminds me of every day.
Does he?
Oh, they always do.
7:30 a.m. It's like a running text message with that guy. He just reminds me that he has a PhD. I'm not sure what's going on there.
So you're a pastor in Dillon, South Carolina, and
that's right.
Part of the Larger for Life podcast crew, going through the larger catechism. So is there anyone on this show that doesn't have a podcast, Jason?
I do not have a podcast.
Jonathan, do you have one?
I do. I don't know that many people listen to it. We have passed 50 downloads on Spotify, which my wife was very proud of. But
so what's this? What's the topic of this podcast?
Yeah, so the title is Weighed in the Balance, and it's an apologetics podcast. So we take claims that people make as though they were just sort of self-evidently true, and we try to peel back the layers to see if it actually is true. So me and a couple friends, a couple weeks ago, we tackled the problem of the canon and whether we have to have sort of an infallible authority like Rome or the Eastern Orthodox to tell us what the canon is, or if there are good reasons that we can have for knowing what the canon is. So you guys have the PCA podcast down. I'm going into apologetics.
Well, somebody has to, as they say. And Ryan Beasy, I think he actually broadcasts on CB radio in his local area is the way he does it. But that's what I heard. No, it's called the Westminster Standard. So enough about other podcasts. Let's attempt to do a podcast here tonight. So I was thinking about review and control. I think that's been the theme of the last few PCA General Assemblies. we've had some surprising results. But sort of like the U.S. electorate, in a way, PCA is evenly divided. For instance, this year at the nominating committee, a different sort of side than last year seemed to prevail. So there'll be a lot of floor nominations this year. Be on the lookout for that. But at the Review of Presbytery Records Committee this year, the opposite was true. And I think that's been the case. Maybe there's a certain kind of person who wants to be involved in that. But some interesting results that are a shift away from where we were, 3 to 5 years ago. And the reports have hit the ShareFile website for PCA commissioners, and there's been a little discussion about this. But let's talk about the general concept of review and control. It's really what separates us from nearly every other form of church government, from Congregationalists, from non-connectional people who think they're more or less reformed, from the episcopacy, where so much power is lodged in the bishops, in the I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, the episcopacy, and but Presbyterianism is its own thing. I'm not sure everybody gets this early on, but it's really the way we maintain doctrine, if we do, and it's important. So, Ryan, you've got a lot of experience with this. I'm going to put a couple of things on screen that may be prompts. But you grew up Lutheran. Lutheranism is a strange hybrid sometimes of episcopacy and Congregationalism, but it's not Presbyterianism.
That is true. I don't know if there could be truer words spoken. Lutheranism is not Presbyterianism. That is true.
Oh, I've got to share that. Okay, go right ahead. So, I mean, it's probably not what brought you. It was probably doctrine that brought you into this orbit, but it's important anyway.
It certainly is. With Lutheranism, it is Congregationalism. The congregation owns its own property, but they are also bishops, and the bishops, though, have very little authority, just administrative in Lutheranism. But this is an important point that you have up there on 11.4, that every court is just as much a church court as any other, and the only difference between a session, a presbytery, and the General Assembly is what the Constitution stipulates is different. So, when there were earlier in this decade, we were trying to get some things added to our Constitution about character qualifications, and some session says, well, we want to be able to uphold that. And one of our former moderators made a point that you can insert that language into your bylaws. You're just as much a court as the General Assembly. So the courts relate to one another on a very respectful way of doing so.
Yeah, let me insert that there's a concept that may or may not be unique to the PCA. I'm not sure. Some of you probably know, but especially in judicial cases, ordinarily, it's our book says that we're going to show great deference to the lower court, believing that they know most about their business. Now, that doesn't rule out, just like the second paragraph that we have on screen, doesn't mean it's not a get out of jail free card or do what you want card. But there is deference to the lower court in many ways. Now, this word court, that might freak some people out. They think that Presbyterians just sit around reading fine print, suing each other, and charging each other. But court just means a body of officers who meet together to do their work. So that's an anachronism. Maybe we shouldn't call them courts. We don't wear robes, all of us, all the time. But I don't know. So maybe Jason wears a robe all the time. I don't know.
I think it also stems from that we don't make law as a church court. Session doesn't make law. We interpret the king's law. And Jason, you were a lawyer once. Is that why?
That is a true statement. I used to practice law. I'm
We're
no
all about
longer
true
practice.
statements tonight.
That's right. That's right. No, I actually think I think Brad's explanation was really good in that court. You think of a king and his court. A king's court. It's a gathering of those who are ruling. It doesn't necessarily have the judicial aspect that we think. Court means judicial. It just means ruling in this aspect, or in the way it's used here. It does have a judicial dimension to it when the court is in judicial business, but it relates more to the general ruling that's occurring when this body is seated together. And so that's where that language, my understanding is that it comes from.
Yeah, that's where session comes from. But seated. So we don't
Exactly
we don't use standing desks in the PCA. We sit down when we meet. We are in session, and we are seshed. So it's important to remember.
And
So
that's where
Ryan,
the robes come out, right?
that's right. So Ryan, and what anyone wears under them is their business, and we might talk to Coach about that. But Ryan, anything else to say? You love to teach about Presbyterianism. So any other insights on this front end?
Yeah, I think the better we understand our polity, the more we'll appreciate it, because it is simply biblical principles summarized. And this is an important point, that a session has just as much right to resolve a question of doctrine before it, but the presbytery can review that. Likewise with presbytery. We'll have conversations with folks. Well, I think that's a matter for presbytery to decide. Well, yes, but it's subject to the review of the whole church in the General Assembly. So the parts are in the whole, and the whole are in the parts.
All right. So another thing to help you understand the idea of a court or the seated elders, the session. You going through the Old Testament, you'll read about men who were seated at the gate of the city. The elders of the city sitting together to decide things, and you kind of get the idea. These are well-to-do guys. They sit around at the city gate and they smoke and whittle, and then they occasionally make judgments. But I'm sure they were more
and exchange sandals.
Yes, and knock the dirt thereof. So yeah. So Jason, this idea of accountability, review, and control, how would you quickly explain that to your congregation or someone new to Presbyterianism?
Right. Yeah, I think this is just a reflection of the principle that we see at the Jerusalem Council in Acts, where there is a question at the local level of do we circumcise or not as a Christian church? And they said, all right, we're going to gather the region together. We're going to gather the presbytery together. Of course, it's a little anachronistic to say that, but this is really the first gathering of the church, the first General Assembly. And so the local churches were accountable to the region. And that's the exact same principle here, that the local church is accountable to the presbytery is accountable to the General Assembly. And I think this is just the way that we're trying to live out that principle of the higher court. The gathering of the region keeps the lower courts accountable. And there's a number of ways that happens in our polity, but one of those is the annual review and control, where we're just reviewing generally everything that happened to make sure there's nothing crazy in there. So that's how I would just describe it. It's just simply that accountability that's built in and that Scripture so clearly indicates for churches.
Yeah, a fixture of Presbyterianism is the keeping of minutes, and not just recording what you want, but recording those things that you're required to record. We can't. I don't know if we lived in a city of 1 million people and that was the presbytery, and we all lived near each other in a high density population, we would probably know or hear what's going on. But because that's not the case, we correspond. We communicate in a written form, and we review each other's records. So the keeping of minutes is important. You might say, well, how did the ancient Israelites do that? Well, I don't know. I was just reading today, and I guess it was in 2 Samuel. David wrote letters, so they were recording things. They were keeping up with things. So,
And in Acts 15, they sent a letter out to the churches, right? So they are keeping records of some kind.
yeah. So
Well,
there's
Brett,
some precedent for that.
and it's important to remember where we get the eldership in Exodus 18 when Jethro's father, or when Moses' father Jethro, he says you got to appoint elders to handle this. You can't handle this by yourself, and he appoints elders in graded courts. Right? There's elders over 50, over hundreds, over thousands, and presumably the elder over the larger group is reviewing the group below.
Yeah, Ryan's wrestling with a child. You podcast listeners won't be able to perceive that unless we hear it. So that's an
cutest
explanation.
member of the Beasy household has joined the program.
Interestingly, they're the same size.
Yeah, that's a trivia fact that some people will believe. All right, Coach. I mean, you're a Southern Presbyterian. Do you have time for all this record keeping stuff and review, or you just want to just be the Southern Baptist Church in town that's a little bit better and baptizes babies?
No, I do not want to be that way. So in our presbytery, the PD presbytery, the greatest name in the PCA world, by the way.
That's PEEPEDEE, named after a river, as are many presbyteries in the PCA.
Right.
Because we're wayfaring, we're seafaring people. Yes.
Yep. And so our what we call our shepherding committee, which I served on for many years, reviews our sessional records. And some session records are more thorough than others. Surely, we even have some churches that still do theirs handwritten on legal pads, and they literally turn in the legal pad at the beginning of the year.
Are you serious? Are you serious?
I'm dead serious. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. There's three of them.
Are they out of printer ink, or what's the deal? I mean, they got that 2002 Hewlett Packard that you can't get ink for anymore.
Hey, these clerks are small town farmers. They've been writing with the same big pen since 1989, and bought bulk yellow legal pads in 1957, and they're just going to use those, and it's fine. Actually, they probably keep the best minutes in our presbytery. They are thorough. They are by the book in all phases, and they don't do anything weird because they're just good old Southern Presbyterian men. But yeah, so you want that review and control. You want that process of being accountable to the presbytery, presbyteries being accountable to the General Assembly. In a lot of ways, you want that as a minister because it protects you as you deal with hard shepherding issues within your local church, hard shepherding issues or disciplinary issues in the presbytery as appeal processes happen and so forth. I know there was a note in the RPR report regarding ruling elders not being named in presbytery records, I saw. And one of the comments that were made saying that you needed to list their names was, well, we need to know who's sitting in the court. We need to know who's making these decisions. We need to know what churches are represented and what members are present. And all of that.
And who has a right to complain about an action. Now, since you mentioned that, I'll just run with it for a minute.
Yeah.
We have a sign-in sheet. We have a table full, about 20 pieces of paper. It's got every teaching elder in the presbytery listed. They sign in if they're there. And yes, Ryan has them because he's our clerk. And then there's also each church with with blanks for how many ruling elders they're eligible to bring, and where to sign in. So yeah, we you mentioned that we don't call it a shepherding committee, we call it a review of session records committee. But, we read in the Bible that biblical shepherds knew all their sheep by name, and they counted. So there's nothing wrong with keeping up with the facts and counting. We count presbyters because presbyters count, to adapt the Southern Baptist saying. So continue, Coach.
No, I was just going to continue to say it's a protection for, ministers and the elders who serve alongside of them. But it also keeps, some unity amongst the doctrinal implications of our own confession and catechism. We need to see how our confession, our catechisms, our theology is being worked out and applied into the context of the local church. I'm in Dillon, South Carolina. Jason's in Ohio. The rest of you are in Tennessee, other than Resby, and we can't officially tell anyone where Resby is currently at this moment. So
I'm in Georgia.
Well, close enough to Tennessee, Ryan, that you want to be in Tennessee. How about that? You want to be in Tennessee, and that's why I just include you in that great state of the union.
Everybody
Ryan,
wants to be in Tennessee.
Ryan's in Georgia, okay. But nonetheless, we have different congregations, we have different regions that we're ministering in. And when we get to the review of presbytery records, we're seeing how, in a lot of ways, the application of our theology is being played out, whether it be stated differences and how they're being ruled, whether it be practices of local churches being, reviewed and debated by the committee or something of the sort. One of the things that we dealt with quite often on our own session review, records review in PD Presbytery is Lord's Day practices from different churches. And so we had lengthy conversations multiple times about what is allowable and what is forbidden according to our standards when it comes to what the local church does on the Lord's Day. Some of those same kind of things would show up when it comes to the review of presbytery records at the General Assembly level. My first General Assembly was in Greensboro in 2017, and we had a lengthy debate that year regarding a presbytery worship bulletin that had an image of Christ on the front of it. And I sat there as a former Pentecostal kid, loving every moment of that.
You weren't confused, horrified, scandalized?
I was very confused because it was like drinking out of a fire hydrant. But when we began talking about Second Commandment violations, I was all in, and I was sitting beside Dominic Aquila.
Here's a fun fact. As that debate was going on, I was driving through a tornado in Western Carolina, coming to meet Resby in the flesh for the first time. And I was there for Thursday night, and it was quite an evening. But anyway, I was streaming on my phone, the live stream, so I could listen to it.
That was quite the assembly overall.
Yeah.
It was not a very good welcome to GA moment.
Well, eventually Chortles had to tell me to stop texting him because every time I would text him, it would boot him off the live stream, and he would have to reload it.
Let's see. You're young. You remember. You have a better memory
technology
than I do. I did take shelter at a Pentecostal church. I got off of I-40 somewhere in the mountains and pulled under the awning of some Pentecostal church while the tornado passed over.
We call those hedges of protection.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Jonathan, you served on the denominational General Assembly National Review of Presbytery Records Committee. You're partly responsible for that 216-page. We have 216 viewers, so a 216-page report that just dropped in the last, or went up. We don't like to say dropped, but was it worth it? Is all the time, effort, blood, sweat, tears, pixels, laptop batteries, is it all worth it?
Oh, absolutely.
And how many years did you age that week?
Well, you aged during the day, but then at night, Steve Tipton brought out all of his bottles of whiskey to share with everybody, and you regained your youth was renewed like the Eagles. No, it was a lot of fun. I got placed on this committee because our former RPR rep, who shall remain nameless, Sean Morris, didn't want to, and told our esteemed clerk that perhaps I would be a better option. And of course,
I think what I heard is that Sean's trousers were wrinkled by the hours of sitting at the table, and he didn't like that. You didn't care, though.
All he told me was, "I think you have better experience to do this." And I was like, "Are you sure, Sean? I mean, I've chaired this review of session records committee for like 2 minutes, but all right, if you want me to go, then if the presbytery votes to let me go, then I'll go." But yeah, no, it was great. I appreciated the debate that we had. I appreciated men who would just state frankly what they thought about a given issue, even if it was Jason Pylan just ripping me to shreds. That was fun. And so I'll tell you a story. So first day, we're going through the minutes of the presbyteries and recommending exceptions, and we get to one that my read team had done, and we had recommended an exception that ended up getting struck for the presbytery allowing a difference that we thought struck at the vitals of religion. And the committee voted against us. And so I'm brand new on this committee. And I went into like Robert's rules mode, where, as you guys know, if your motion fails, you can't just remake the motion. You have to think of a different thing to move if you want to try to accomplish the same kind of thing. And so I moved that they be cited for not restricting his teaching of that view, because there was a motion in the minutes to restrict his teaching that failed. I didn't know nobody had ever moved to cite a presbytery for not restricting somebody's views before, but Steve Tipton, who was in the chair at the time, his eyes got really big. And that was my first indication that I might have misstepped, so to speak. It led to a very vigorous debate, and that exception did not pass. And I will not be making that motion in the future. But it was a great learning experience for me, and I just loved every second of it.
Oh, well, that's you're the only person that loved every second of it. I'm quite
This
sure.
was supposed to be penance for you, Jonathan.
No, it's absolutely true that you're the only one that loved that, because loved every second. I mean, we went from 9 a.m. till 10 p.m. With 2 45-minute meal breaks and a 10-minute bathroom break. And that's Wednesday and Thursday, and then half day Friday. I mean, these are long days. I've been around a number of different committees and meetings and things in the PCA, and there's nothing like RPR. It's very different. There's 60 men in the room, in a small room. We're pretty tightly packed together. There's not even room on the desks for all of our computers. So we're sitting there with computers in our laps, BCOs on the floor, Robert's rules spread around us, trying to make sense of these.
Did you say sweaty men? Is that what you said?
They're yes, they become
Okay.
sweaty men. That's right. Smells like a locker room by the end of the day. No, it's really fascinating, and it's not what I was describing to somebody who was new this year and wanted to get some thoughts before he showed up. It's not a political thing. It's not a political room. It's not like everybody lines up on their side and it's just political fights and it's just clear. Everybody takes, I'll agree with Jonathan on one issue, the next issue I'll disagree with him on, and there's a lot of fluidity because it's not clearly a political thing. We're looking at the BCO. We're coming to kind of different conclusions on some finer points of the BCO. And so I really appreciate that. It's guys coming without, it's not just, okay, is my side going to win here? We're really grappling with real interesting polity questions. And so I always learn a lot. It's a really, really instructive week with all the guys there.
Yeah, and there were times when, I'm not saying that this happened to me, I'm just saying it didn't only happen to me, that guys would make a motion and then in the course of debate be persuaded that their motion was not a good idea. And so then when it came for time to vote, nobody voted in favor of it because we got to hear from our brothers and like, oh, actually, yeah, that's a good point. All right, I can't withdraw my motion, but I'm just not going to vote for it.
But for all the disagreement in the PCA, I've said many times, I don't know if anybody ever hears me, but nearly everyone at Presbytery is a capable, principled, impressive person. And when I'm at Presbytery and I hear people speak from whatever perspective, I think, that guy's probably better. He's probably, morally my superior, intellectually my superior, and that's an impressive person. There are some ecclesial contexts where that wouldn't be the case. I mean, from whence I came, that was not often the impression I had. So I think we should recognize that there's a lot of good men and a lot of good things in the PCA. But as J. Crescent Machen said, the things about which men are agreed are apt to be the least important. The really important things are the things about which men will fight. So we fight, but we fight nicely, hopefully, in a winsome,
decently,
ethical way. Yes, well, that's a bit much to ask sometimes. Coach, I know you're wanting to say something.
I'm just sitting here thinking about the fact that Jason just discouraged all men from wanting to serve on RPR. Crammed, sweaty, locker room just does not sound appeasing.
Well, some people like that. I'm not.
I feel like you should probably.
That was not my experience. On our side of the room, we had plenty of space. Everybody's computer fit on the table.
It must have been the men I was around. Yes.
Jason's just like sitting up front.
What kind of food did they bring
I'm in
in?
the back row.
Let's try to make this more attractive. What kind of food did they bring in, Jason?
They bring in a barbecue dinner for you one night.
Oh, okay.
They bring in some great Italian lasagna for you one night. They have unlimited Coke all day long. You can take your pick. I mean, it's
Coke.
They feed you well.
And that would be Coca-Cola. Thing.
And Steve Tipton brings a Rubbermaid of whiskey.
And I'll bet there was some that Zen smokeless whatever. What do you call those things? Yes, nicotine pods. I'll bet they were. Well, it could have been frowned upon, but I'll bet they were tolerated.
There's probably a lot of cigar and pipe smoke and Zens. Yes, I mean you have to have some sort of nicotine to hold your attention that long. So unless
you're Jonathan and he was high. He was high on life. High on the Presby life right there.
You haven't listened to Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson? It's a new topic.
Yeah. I keep saying I'm not going back, but
everybody says that.
So Ryan, any thoughts on what we've discussed so far? Since you've got the toddler dispatched.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering if the amount of deodorant that was worn is perhaps the reason why one side had no room for computers and the other side had plenty of space. Was there a musky, oniony smell where there was plenty of computer space?
Let's hope there was no Axe body spray involved.
It just makes it worse.
Yeah. All right, so that's the general. I mean, that's sort of how it works. We minute our meetings. We minute, and this is where a lot of mistakes come in, but it's important. Congregational meetings. Often the rules for congregational meetings, elections, purchase of property, election of officers. A lot of churches, in my experience, because I've served on a review of session records committee. I'm not a chairman because I'm not a dummy, not a sucker, as it were, but I'm on the committee, and you often see problems with congregational meetings because we have this meeting and we're all getting together, we all agree it's our meeting, and whose business is it how we do it? But that's important, and is to protect the rights of the church members. A certain number of church members can can request a congregational meeting. You can, we recently elected a committee, and there were 2 or 3 ways to do it for our church. And any member could have stood up and said, I don't think what the session is recommending here is right, and I think I want to vote on the way I want to do it. It was the composition of a committee, and there were more than one ways to do it. We had unanimity, but it didn't have to be that way. So the minutes, the record that you keep of those meetings, is the only way anyone outside your church, and maybe even yourself, when you go back and look at it, whether it was done properly. But convincing people that's important can be tough. So thoughts on the rights of church members and sometimes the difficulty of following all the rules for congregational meetings. I'm sure you've had some experience with that.
What I tell people is, if it's not in the minutes, it didn't happen. It has to be in the minutes recorded for us to have any record that anything actually happened. And you're right, congregational meetings, they either go one of 2 ways. They either go, the congregation doesn't know their rights, and so if the session brings a recommendation, they feel like, well, I guess we have to go along with it, and so nobody speaks up and does anything. Or the congregation on the other end says, no, we are in control here, and we're not going to let the session tell us what to do, and they go and assert all their rights, which is their right to do, but oftentimes they don't understand the rules and the parameters that they have to operate within. And as I'm chairman right now of our session review committee at Presbytery. And what I tell the new guys who are coming on the committee, I said, we need to look out for 2 things. One is officers, election of officers, nomination of officers, anything related to officers from the congregational level, that is prime. We have to watch that to make sure that men are properly nominated, properly trained, properly elected, and properly installed and ordained. That's key. And then the other piece is anything related to the membership roles, whether you're adding new members, whether you're dismissing a member, whether there's discipline, anything related to the roles. You can't just strike somebody from the roles just because you don't like them. That's absolutely not appropriate. So we need to watch those things.
But it happens all the time. Our presbytery is just like yours, same issues. So, Ryan, tell us why it's important that we have a membership role, and that when people leave, we don't just erase their name, literally erase the name or draw a line through their name. What's the principle behind our aspirational fastidiousness about this? I say that because we don't always do it right, but we know that we're supposed to. But why?
Well, there's a biblical principle from the Old Covenant Church, the Book of Numbers. They're knowing who is in the church. The group that came out of Egypt was a mixed multitude. So for all those racial realists out there, even Israel in the Old Covenant Church was not ethnically pure. But when they get to the Book of Numbers, they number the tribes. And then, of course, in the New Covenant Church, there are certain numbers of people added to them. And how did they know how many? Because they counted, because their names were written down somewhere. So there's the biblical principle. Then there's a pragmatic principle that if your congregation is going to buy property, and you have to vote on that, and if you're going to get a loan, the bank is going to want to see those documents, and so you need to have some role so you can know who decides whether we can buy property, whether it's the session determining it, whether it's the congregational meeting. And then there's the shepherding aspect that Hebrews 13:7, it's in the last chapter, that honor your leaders, remember your leaders, respect your leaders, the ones who are keeping watch over your soul. There's the leaders of the church, the elders of the church are responsible for a certain group of people. They're not responsible. I am not the pastor of every single person in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. I am accountable for the people who are on the roll at First Presbyterian Church, Fort Oglethorpe. In fact, I got an email from a guy who was upset at me for not responding quickly enough to one of his emails. And I said, look, I am first and foremost the pastor of this church, and then I'm a member of this presbytery, and then I'm a member of the PCA, and you're not a part of any of those things. So we have accountability, and we have responsibility as overseers to watch out for this group of people instead of that group of people.
Yeah, and we take seriously, I know my church works very hard at this. If someone moves away, we hound them, but we try to make sure that they join another church. And we're supposed to record that. If we transfer, if we receive someone, we should say where they came from, and if someone leaves, we should say where they go. Of course, I think this is common to probably all presbyteries. The number one form of church discipline that's enacted is removing people from the rolls in an act of discipline without process for leaving the church and not coming back and not letting us know that they've joined another church. But that's about the soul, because our standards that, the Westminster says, ordinarily outside of the church, there's no possibility of salvation. So we're concerned about the state of the soul of someone who professes faith, joins a church, and leaves not for another church, but for nothing. That makes us concerned about that their faith is non-existent as their church membership now is. So it's very important, and it calls us. It reminds the session that we're supposed to keep watch, as Ryan said, over people's souls, and we can't just forget people. And the list is helpful, but also the knowledge that somebody up the line is going to be looking at that, as Jason said. So, any more thoughts on this? The shepherding, individual souls, but also the care of the congregation in honoring their rights and privileges in all this.
I think fundamentally, what we're doing in reviewing records is we are here to care for the sheep. We're not here just because we care about finding people who mess up. We're here because we care about the sheep.
But that's fun. That's fun, though.
I mean, for some people, sure. Yeah. My personality enjoys that, but it's not necessarily a good thing that I enjoy that. I need to be propelled by caring for the flock and caring for the sheep. And that's really why we do this at both the session level and the presbytery level, reviewing those records. It's for the protection of the flock, for the good of the sheep, and to make sure their rights are protected, that they're heard, they're given the opportunity to vote when they can vote, when they're supposed to be voting, they can complain when they have a complaint to bring. This is for the good of the church.
Yeah, and it is our opportunity to look out for the sheep that are subject to the jurisdiction of the lower courts. I heard a guy tell me one time he was in a church that unfortunately ended up closing its doors. And when he, after having gone to another church, was at presbytery, somebody said to him that basically he hadn't known how bad things actually were. And he said, yeah, I don't think a lot of people did, but I wish they had, because we really needed help. Now, we obviously show great deference to the lower court, just like Brad said, but that was an instance of a church member saying, I wish the higher court had done something. And it's not always clear in the minutes that there is something to do, but we review them so that we can be looking out for the sheep in those congregations and presbyteries.
That's a good point. If you read, of course, when you're on one of these committees, you get a document. Used to be actual printed, paper, but you get a PDF, which could be 70, 80 pages, and it's all the minutes of a church for a year. And you have, from looking at those documents, sometimes you can see there's a real problem here. You can see that the pastor is being a third of the congregation thinks the pastor is abusive. That's a red flag. Okay, if they have a congregational meeting to talk about how everyone's mad at the pastor, now that should come to the presbytery. But if it doesn't, it comes by way of the review of records. We don't send people. I think there's some traditions where they have what's called a district visitor. I think Lutherans have that, where they go around and visit churches the way, an elder might go visit someone in his congregation. But you can only tell so much from that. But we don't spy on each other. But we review these records to make sure that important things, needful things, are being done, and we help each other. A lot of times, the review, it's not to rebuke; it's to say, here's the way you should have done this. And sometimes those cited or called to account are appreciative of that. So, speaking of people who aren't appreciative, what do you say to someone who just says, why can't we just leave each other alone? Why can't we just get along? Like Rodney King, we got new riots in Los Angeles, but 33 years ago or so, some earlier riots, someone said, why can't we just all get along? Because we're Reformed and we understand the doctrine of total depravity, we know that we can't all get along, and we're not going to, but we take measures to try to mitigate. But why can't we just all get along? Why can't we let everyone do what they want to do, and when we come together for presbytery, or as some people often ask, for General Assembly, why don't we just come together and have a good time and hang out? Why can't we do that?
Well, Brad, I think that's a very good question. And the answer to that is simply because we are Presbyterian. If people want to do that, there are ecclesiastical fellowships they could join. That's called, what you've just described is called Congregationalism. But in
But
Presbyterianism,
why can't we just have a little bit of that, and let's just pick the parts of it we like,
but who
buffet
decides
Presbyterianism.
who decides what's a little bit? Who decides that? So
Let's trust each other. Let's just all trust each other, Ryan.
well, what do we trust each other on, right?
Well, So there are some people that just can't handle the fact, and I'm not talking about necessarily people in the PCA. I'm saying there are people who just would recoil at the whole idea of review and control and of accountability. Why can't we just love Jesus and do anything we want to do?
I mean, it gets back to what you were saying earlier with Chapter 11 of the BCO and the session, when it acts, it's acting for the PCA. When the session is admitting members or doing the active discipline, it's acting for the PCA. And so we are all connected. That this is really a test of, are we truly connected or not? And so what I care about what's happening in North Carolina, in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Tennessee. I care what's happening there because that's the PCA acting there, and we are accountable to one another. One of the questions you take for ordination is, will you submit to the brethren? Are you going to submit one another to one another? And that means following the Book of Church Order. That means when you're told that you're interpreting it wrong or doing something wrong, it means you're willing to be corrected by a higher court in that way. And so the question is, and it's to your point, Brad, like, do you truly believe we're connected and that we're accountable one to another, or are you truly a Congregationalist? And I agree. I think if you're in the PCA, you care about these things. You're in the PCA. One of the questions I ask of every candidate, it's a very leading question, but anybody coming up for ordination or transfer or licensure, I say, are you a Presbyterian by conviction or by convenience? It's easy to be a Presbyterian by convenience when all your friends are there, when you happen to, maybe you came in to PCA church, you were converted to PCA church, and you're like, yes, I love PCA. But sometimes we're there for convenience and not because of conviction. And this makes us say, places like BCO 11 make us say, am I really a convinced Presbyterian by conviction? And if we are, then yeah, we care about what's going on in each other's backyards because we love each other and we want to see the peace and the purity of the church. So, I mean, the question is, are we truly connectional in our theology or not? And if we are, then we'll live it out in practice.
All right, let me read that second paragraph of BCO 11:4. It's on the screen, but most of our, we have 10 times more people downloading and listening than watching because there are two kind of people in the world. There's YouTube people and podcast people, and podcast people are a lot smarter than YouTube people. So that's why most of our listeners are podcast people. But be that as it may, every court has the right to resolve questions of doctrine and discipline seriously and reasonably proposed, and in general, to maintain truth and righteousness, condemning erroneous opinions and practices which tend to the injury of the peace, purity, or progress of the church. Although each court exercises original jurisdiction over all matters especially belonging to it, the lower courts are subject to the review and control of the higher courts in regular gradation. In other words, session, presbytery, General Assembly. Continuing, these courts are not separate and independent tribunals, but they have a mutual relation, and every act of jurisdiction is the act of the whole church performed by it through the appropriate organ. You know, if we convict someone in a church trial or something, the sentence pronounced is the sentence of the Presbyterian Church in America. And so I think there's sometimes a confusion, and I'd like to hear what Coach thinks about this. Because we're a grassroots denomination, which means, I think it particularly means because of our history with the old Southern Mainline Church, no one has claim on anyone else's property or money in the PCA. But I think we take that principle of, we're independent in that way to we're independent to some degree in other ways. You can't tell us what to do. It's easy to leave the PCA. It takes, you have to give a month's notice on the meeting, but a simple majority of the membership, I believe, can vote, and you're gone. You're out. The presbytery or the General Assembly can't take your property, can't make you do anything that you don't want to do. But because there's no claim on property does not mean there's no claim on truth and the standards that we adhere to. But Coach, you're a southern guy. Southern man don't need the presbytery around anyhow, right?
No, we absolutely need the presbytery and the General Assembly. Actually, one of the points that I was going to make that you've already made is that when we act in a disciplinary manner in a judgment, we say that this is a judgment by the Presbyterian Church in America. We are acting as an arm, if you will, or a branch of the denomination as a whole. And so when we take, as Jason was pointing out, when we take vows to adhere to this form of government, to this book of church order, to this system of doctrine, the review and control of even sessional records or presbytery records is ensuring that those vows are enacted and faithfully adhered to on the local level or on the regional level. And so when we care deeply about the peace and purity and the unity of our denomination or our presbytery, we now have what we would say skin in the game. We have skin in the game for how, Jason in Ohio enacts discipline according to the Word of God. We have skin in the game for how ministers in our presbytery act and shepherd and conduct themselves. We have skin in the game for the way in which our churches practice according to our system of doctrine. And so we absolutely need this accountability, these checks and balances. And while our grassroots nature in the PCA is a feature and not a bug, I'm very appreciative for the grassroots emphasis, and that's why we do give deference to the lower courts. We need someone to help us shepherd the flock of Christ well. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about the Old Testament, the elders sitting at the gate, and there's this unique, really, way in which the Old Testament talks about the eldership, and it almost interchangeably talks about elders as also judges. And it talks about them in almost a civil realm, and we don't have time to get into the nation of Israel and the New Testament church and all these things. But the act
we're putting the band back together. Come on now.
But for the act of judging and leading, it is in fact a feature of our shepherding. And I think that's been very clear as we've been talking about the peace, unity of the church, protecting the rights of our members. This is all a part of the way in which we have agreed that we are to shepherd the flock of Christ as under shepherds, so that when the chief shepherd appears, we may rejoice and not hide in shame. Because as Ryan was talking about in Hebrews 13, obey your leaders, submit to them, because they're the ones that are going to have to give an account. And it's good for us now to have those checks and balances to make sure that we're shepherding well and ruling well and leading well, so that when we stand before the Lord in judgment, we can say, we have really been striving to do this faithfully. And so that's why we need one another to do this.
Okay, before I forget, we've sort of overlooked, and when we come to the review of Presbytery Records Report, which will come up on Thursday, I guess, at General Assembly, a big part of, or is it Wednesday? I think it's Thursday. A big part of the disputes every year have to do with the doctrine and positions and convictions, positions of ministers. So I think the biggest job of the presbytery usually is being a gatekeeper and a shepherd to the ministers. The admission to the teaching ministry of the PCA is done through the presbyteries. Every minister is examined. Every minister is questioned and by the presbytery, and that's a big part of the presbytery records that are reviewed at the national level. So, you think, this is not important. Well, is it important that the ministers in your denomination hold proper doctrine and preach proper truth and baptize the right people in the right way? So let's talk about that. The gatekeeping function, the presbytery is the door to the ministry. And once you get in, of course, me, the ruling elder, I always like to say, presbytery can feel like pastor's club. And it seems like if you get in pastor's club, it's really hard to get out. But that's my perspective. But let's talk about the truth protecting gatekeeping function of the presbytery. And then we should probably talk a little bit about good faith subscription, because that's where a lot of the controversy comes in. But Jonathan, how about that? It's not been that long that you had to go through a presbytery to get into the ministry.
Yeah, well, Brad, the New Testament only tells the presbytery to do one thing. We're only explicitly told to do one thing, and that is to lay hands on men. And the only thing we are told about how to do that is not to do it too quickly. It is a very weighty responsibility that we have in examining men for the ministry and ordaining men for the ministry. And I am not on that committee in our presbytery, but I was examined fairly recently, and for me, it felt like it flew by, because I was actually very comfortable. I was just like, whatever, if you're going to fail me, and I'll go back home and see my wife and baby. But
I think I was on your committee, wasn't I?
You were.
Was I mean, terrible, aggressive?
Oh, the worst. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Good.
No, it's funny. I had heard horror stories the whole time I was in seminary about being up for
our presbytery. Your horror stories?
Not about our presbytery.
Yeah, Ryan Beasy. Is that who you heard about?
Just about these guys that were like super stressed out about trying to make sure that they had everything down. And I prepared, and I was sort of wondering how bad is this actually going to be? And it was rigorous, but that was good. And that's what we want, is for men to really have to work hard to pass their exams. But ideally, if you're well trained in seminary, you should know most of this stuff, I think. But inevitably, you will have guys who will state a difference. I say inevitably. It actually isn't inevitable. I do know people who haven't stated differences with the Westminster standards, but it is very
How
common.
many of them do you know? Because Charles Hodge only knew about half a dozen men. So how many men do you know that have no differences with the Westminster Standards?
I know some on this this 6-person call. Okay.
So I know 3.
3. You know half as many. In a better age, Charles Hodge knew only 6 guys that stated no differences with Westminster. That is fascinating to me.
But we have to examine those differences to see if they are either hostile to the system of doctrine taught in the Westminster Standards, or if they strike at the vitals of religion. Most of the time, when men come to our presbytery and they state a difference, I will vote to allow the difference. I have voted no once. And it was for a man who said that he believed that you should be able to make images of the second person of the Trinity because you could portray his humanity, but not his divinity. And I voted no. The reason I voted no is because of Chalcedon and the fact that you actually cannot separate the humanity and the divinity. But unless it got to that point, I have usually voted yes. But that's part of our job, is to look at the differences that are allowed by the lower court and see if they do strike at the vitals or if they're hostile to the system.
Yeah, I meant to bring that terminology up earlier. There's, when a minister says there's these 3, let's say there's these 3 parts of the Westminster Standards that I don't necessarily agree with. The presbytery judges if the difference is semantic, in other words, just about words and phrasing, something like that, and a lot of times it's just a misunderstanding. Then there can be more than semantic, but not striking at the vitals. In other words, you clearly have a difference, but we don't think it's a big deal. And then there's the strikes at the vitals, and that person can't be ordained. That rarely happens, but that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about in the RPR report. And there are some Presbyterians who obstinately cling to the idea that the second commandment and the fourth commandment are a really big deal. And that's where a lot of our differences come in, differences about differences. And some differences have become so common as to become unexceptional, but it's difficult to change our Constitution, and the standards we have are the standards we have, and we have to deal with that. So, thoughts on differences, good faith subscription, all that.
Well, Brad, you need to mention the layer to this, that if a presbytery rules a stated difference, more than semantic, but not striking at the vitals, and this has been somewhat of a controversy, not recently in the last 2 years, I guess, but 3, 4, 5 years ago, that a presbytery has the right to limit that man's teaching as well.
Yeah, to not teach the doctrine that's counter to the standards, or occasionally you can mention it, but you need to also mention the confessional view.
And that was a big deal in RPR reports in 2017, 2018, and some have even carried over into as late as 2022, 2023. So,
yeah.
So, but presbyteries do have a lot of freedom. We have at least one presbytery in the PCA which will not accept a man who does not hold to six-day, 24-hour creation, and that has not been banned or overturned in the PCA. There are some presbyteries that give you the stink eye, I'm told, if you don't take any exceptions, because they can't believe that an intelligent modern person would not have a list of exceptions to the standards. So
Well, hold
there's a
on.
range there. Go ahead.
You don't bring your exceptions to presbytery. You bring all your differences to presbytery, and
Right.
presbytery determines if you're going to get an exception or
Yes,
you're
they
just going to
grant
go EPC.
they grant the exceptions. Yes, differences. I'm being
That's it.
sloppy, but and you're
Well,
being pedantic. But what's new?
it's a matter of principle.
And I think you've mentioned good faith subscription a couple times, and I think it does come into play here, and I think in a helpful way. Maybe I have a minority view on what good faith subscription is. I think we are still debating even what it means. But my understanding, and I'm no historian, I could be proven wrong. My understanding is it was actually an attempt to codify a way of reviewing men that had differences. Because before, men had differences, and Ryan, I think I've heard you make this point before. Men have always had differences in the PCA, and good faith subscription was a way not to loosen the bounds, but a way to make sure men could take their ordination vows in good faith by recording what those differences are, and every difference being judged by the presbytery. It has to be in writing, and then it has to be reviewed by the General Assembly. So my view of good faith subscription is actually that it's a built-in mechanism for the higher court reviewing these differences. Before, again, those were not reviewed by the General Assembly, but once good faith subscription came in, and RAO 14.3 or 16.3 was amended to require grading every single stated difference by the presbytery grading every candidate's stated difference in one of those categories that you laid out, Brad. Now that's subject to review by the high court, and that's what RPR does. And it brings recommendations to the General Assembly, and the Assembly determines what is out of accord, what's appropriate, what's not. And so I actually like good faith subscription because it is simply a mechanism of getting these differences before the higher court to judge, okay, are we all on the same page here or not? Or is this beyond the pale and this is not acceptable in our denomination?
Yeah, ideally it would do that, but I think some people take it and run with it, and then even begin to apply it to practice, which we should not allow our churches and ministers not to follow, the processes and some of the clear teachings, as with officers, ordaining officers, what you call officers, things like that. We can't make up our polity. Truth, there's a bond in having shared truth, but I think there's also unity engendered by shared practice, and whether that's in the minutia of polity, the church government, or even in worship. I think we have an idea that anything goes in some ways, and the principle of good faith subscription, I think sometimes is too generalized and applied too widely. I think
it's taken as license to, but I don't think it was. It's
oh no,
intended
no,
to be
I don't
that
think
way.
it was. No, I don't think it was meant to be that way. So,
And in our vows, we receive and adopt the Westminster Standards as containing the system of doctrine that is contained in the Holy Scriptures. And so good faith subscription is not system subscription. It's not loose subscription. It is full subscription. And you are saying anywhere where you differ with the Westminster Standards and Presbytery judges, can you still subscribe to the full Westminster Standards? And the word containing the system of doctrine contained in the Holy Scriptures is quoting from Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 1, where the Word of God is contained in the Scriptures of the Old and New Testament. So we can't interpret our ordination vows in a Bardian way. All right, the Bardians believe that the Word of God is contained somewhere in the Scriptures of the Old and New Testament. Maybe not the whole part. Maybe not, Nehemiah 6:8. Maybe not there. I don't know. That's not how we are not free to interpret our standards in a Bardian way, our vows in a Bardian way. The system is contained in the Westminster Standards.
Yeah, I think we have the idea sometimes that our doctrine is biblical, but our church order and our polity is sort of less so. But if you read the first few pages of the BCO, we say explicitly that we believe that our polity is biblical, and it's just as biblical as our doctrine. And separating doctrine and polity, is just like separating doctrine and worship. You shouldn't do it, and these are mutually reinforcing things. Did I lose you all?
Just well said.
Okay,
We can't
all right.
we can't follow that up.
Oh yeah. No, you couldn't. Yeah, you were all speechless. Yeah, I thought we'd lost our connection. Sometimes when you have 6 people, no one knows when to speak.
What about
So-
some of these hostile views that are contained in the RPR report? Not to exhaust the RPR report, but that are simply in there, sprinkled about.
Well, if you
have
if
a
you want,
particular one in mind.
yeah, just let's we're not, even if you look at the RPR report, it doesn't use names generally, so we're not trying to call attention to any individual. We don't want to get that specific. But yeah, what are the contemporary issues, points of contention in the PCA? I think that's what you're getting at.
Well, there's pay to communion, and there's marriage to papists, and pictures. So it all starts with the letter P. Pictures of the Godhead, papists, and pay to communion.
I think you preached about this last Sunday. That's why you've got the alliteration down.
I just preached from the RPR, from
GPT helped them out with that one.
from the first book of Thomas Rickard.
Yeah,
All right,
so we had
let's talk about them. Let's talk about those issues, because those people are concerned about that.
I think Coach wants to talk about marriage to papists.
I was going to say, I do have comments and thoughts about that, but I do want to also add, though, there is one that's not a P, but you have the stated difference on women preaching out of
Priestesses.
Gary, that just recently had a woman preaching. And so
priestess preaching.
Well, bishop, whatever.
An Episcopalian lady.
An Episcopalian, yep. And so there are some substantial notes that are necessary to read over in the RPR report. To circle back to something Brad said, a lot of times what we see in these RPR reports is just presbyteries missing information, and their response to missing information is essentially, my bad, we did do that, we'll correct our minutes. And it's, nothing negligent, nothing nefarious, it's just simply a recording clerk missed a sentence or something along those lines. And so, RPR is not a witch hunt in and of itself, but things like, is it proper for a Christian to marry a Roman Catholic? Or is it proper in the PCA for a man to believe that a woman can preach? Those things do come up, and RPR does catch those things, and they flag them as exceptions with substance. I think that's right, Jonathan and Jason.
That's correct. Exceptions of substance. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And so now it's up to the General Assembly to debate these things and to rule, is this striking at the vitals, or is this more than semantic?
And these are very rare things, but the rarity of an error, it doesn't diminish its importance any.
Correct.
I think we know about leaven and lumps and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, so the permissibility of a woman preaching, I don't remember, Jason, you might remember better than I do. I don't remember that sparking much debate. I think the committee was pretty unified on that was an exception of substance. Paedo communion did definitely spark a lot of debate over whether that, and particularly the view articulated by this gentleman, was hostile to the system. And so that was a very lengthy debate, a very passionate debate. Where I came down with that one was, I did not believe that it was kind to that man to make him take vows that would bind him to our book of church order, which does not allow paedo communion, given how he articulated his difference. You guys may have been in a situation like this that I was in, where there was a couple attending our church who are great. I love them. I actually would love for them to join our church at some point, because they haven't. They've been regular attenders for a long time. But they asked me on the way out the door one Sunday, why don't you commune babies at this church? And I said, well, we want to take Paul's words seriously in 1 Corinthians, that you need to examine yourself, because to partake in an unworthy manner is actually a very dangerous thing. He says you eat and drink judgment on yourself if you partake in an unworthy manner. So we want to make sure that our children are well catechized and that they can discern the body before they come to the table. And then the conversation just kept going, and me trying to give very different, very nice, gentle, winsome versions of that answer, until finally the husband basically grabbed the wife by the arm and said, he's not going to agree with you. And they left. So I didn't think that it was kind to that man to make him have to have that conversation, given the difference that he held with the view that I think you have to articulate based on what our BCO says. That vote was by no means unanimous. It did, I think, have to go to division, but that was where I had landed on that.
So let me ask this. We're not going to go much longer, but we only have 2 sacraments. It would seem like doing them properly is really important. We don't have 7. We don't want to bat 80%, like Roman Catholics could. We only got 2. Why is there such? I don't think there's that much sympathy for paedo communion, which came in with the Federal Vision 20 years ago. So came from like a cruel beast slouching towards us from Moscow, and why is there still sympathy for that? I mean, I think it's more sentiment than doctrine. Well, why is there let's just say 20-30% of people in the PCA who aren't troubled by ignoring the clear biblical teaching on who are the rightful recipients of the Lord's Supper. It's quite clear, I think. But what explains it? I'd love to hear somebody tell me why.
The argument the argument that I've always heard is that, if we believe that the Lord's Supper is the New Testament parallel to Passover in the Old Testament.
Yeah, but we know better. We know better. People who know better are still sympathetic to those who have the error. Why is that?
I'm not sure about the sympathy part, but I was involved with a investigation request to a presbytery who had a church in its bounds, very openly practicing paedo communion on their live stream. You could watch little babies being given the juice or wine-soaked bread because they didn't have any teeth to chew. And so when I was working with that, talking to a bunch of trusted individuals, I just started working through our confession of faith, our catechisms, and our book of church order. And I just kind of listen to these numbers. I won't give you all the references I have, but in our confession of faith, to have a paedo communion exception in the PCA, it would require 5 stated differences with the confession, 8 stated differences with the larger catechism, 3 stated differences with the shorter catechism, and then even though it's not allowed, you would have to have 3 stated differences with our book of church order.
Or scruples, as we often state.
Though I think that scruples diminishes the veracity of the stated difference. I think that even in a strict subscription denomination like the OPC, they allow for some minor scruples where Paedo communion would not be scruple-like. It would be very hostile to the system of doctrine. And when you're
Well,
working with,
and the
when you're
reason we're
working with
concerned,
12,
about
15
people's doctrine is because it affects practice, right?
Right.
I mean, the reason a doctrinal difference is a big deal is because it's going to issue in practice, or it's going to violate the conscience of someone. And I'm not a minister, but being a minister, pastor, is difficult enough without having to grit your teeth or cross your fingers or do, only part of what you think you ought to be doing. So it is about practice ultimately, and it's about what we preach.
Yeah, it's interesting at RPR as these things came up. Nobody in the room identified as holding to the Paedo communion view, but yet they would argue to defend other people's right to hold the view in the PCA, or to think that it was permissible for others to hold that view. And that's just an interesting thing to think about. What kind of latitude do we think is appropriate, right? I don't take any difference on Second Commandment, Fourth Commandment issues, but I will allow a guy to come in. I will not vote against a guy who can well articulate a difference with the Second Commandment. As much as I disagree, I'm at this point okay saying, okay, I'm not going to vote against him. Now there are some who can't articulate it very well, and I can't vote in favor of them. But like how latitudinarian are we? And where does that line get drawn? And it's just a really interesting question we need to reflect on and be self-critical in our own approach to these things. And these issues coming up at GA are going to make us say, well, of course we don't believe that, but is it okay for somebody else to believe that? And to hold an office in the PCA? And what's that line? What's the rule? What's that test that we're going to hold ourselves to and others to as we come up to these kinds of issues over and over and over again? It's a question I haven't fully been able to answer myself, but one that we all have to answer as we make these judgments on these cases that come up.
Yeah, it's worth considering. It's worth fighting over if you really have to do it. But
That's right. And one of the interesting things about GA, since we are GA prep, I'm going to make a few comments here as people are getting ready for GA with this. And that's the RPR report at GA is the one report where it's the Wild West. You can amend, you can strike, you can do anything to it from the floor. There's no other report like that at GA. And so when the RPR report comes forward, get ready. People are going to pull out all kinds of issues that they're going to want to debate. You're going to need to bring a notepad to write down everything. It's going to take us all a while to figure out what's going on and where we are. And at RPR, there were, in my count, I believe there were 7 notices of minority reports provided at the RPR meeting. Now, none of them were actually filed, but that shows that there were people at RPR ready to defend a view. And partly why minority reports don't need to be filed is because members of RPR can stand up on the floor of GA and amend the report on the floor without having filed a minority report beforehand. And so I expect that's going to happen on a number of these issues at RPR or at GA during the RPR report. So it's important to read through the 200-page document, note some things, flag some things, and people who are at RPR will need to be prepared to maybe defend the committee. Our chairman's tasked with that job, and I'm sure he's going to ask others to assist with that. But on the floor, members of RPR can do that. Anybody in the GA can do that. So I think it's an important report for people to read and be prepared for, because there will be a lot of debate on it.
Jason, I'm sorry, Brad.
no, is it Thursday afternoon or is it
Wednesday morning.
Oh, okay.
8:30 a.m. Huh?
Oh,
okay.
so if you're watching,
I don't know about 8:30, but
if you're watching the live stream, definitely.
It's not an order of the day, right?
It is not.
Yeah,
It is not.
I think nominating committee is the order of the day on Thursday, if I'm not mistaken.
9:30, I think, on Thursday. Jason,
You get to
and
see
Jonathan,
Coach on the big stage, guys.
ooh, Mr. Chairman.
That's right.
Brad, can I ask our RPR members for their thoughts on this? With members of overtures, they're not allowed to enter into debate on the overtures committee report. It seems like since members of RPR have the option of submitting a minority report, and letting the assembly preview their concerns, it would seem like the courteous thing to do would be to provide a minority report. If there's something in here that a bunch of you don't like, and I've got the RPR report up on the other screen, that's why I'm pointing over there. Would it not be the courteous thing to do, the orderly thing to do, to submit a minority report rather than just yank a bunch of things out and try to follow on the fly? What are your thoughts about an RAO, an assembly operation rule change to prohibit RPR members from speaking during the RPR debate? What do you think about that?
I think it's great. I think it's needed. I think either that or we get rid of minority reports altogether and then just expect everyone to come from the floor. Because it's not needed if you can speak from the floor. But I would prefer that, actually. I've talked to a number of people about that. I think it's time for that, because over the last 5 years, it's been growing, the number of RPR members who stand up on the floor and then move to amend the RPR report when they've had the opportunity and they've lost at RPR, and now they stand up on the floor of GA and make their same arguments and they win because the committee's caught flat-footed. It would be better if the minority report was filed in advance. The committee can prepare for it. The chairman can prepare. He can ask somebody to prepare on his behalf, and then the minority report can prepare and they can bring the best arguments and stand on the podium and present their arguments to the GA. I think that rule makes sense to me.
Yeah,
and a lot of times they lose on the floor too, but they can't. If we could look at it in advance and think about it together, we might not have as much debate.
Right.
I don't know.
I agree.
Well, maybe the cure here is like a 5-hour, RPR report this year, and that would
that's right.
That would cause reform. All right. Well, I just got to see this. You're all a bunch of geeks, every one of you, and I don't know if anyone's ever done a show and talked for an hour and a half about reviewing records and all that, but we've done it.
We could go longer.
You're cutting us off, Brad.
Yeah,
we could go 3 hours. We could go 3 hours.
Mention the Chesapeake Presbytery one, where they licensed a guy who held a view that struck at the vitals, and that's an interesting one for me. Because I read through their response and it's essentially like, we told him he couldn't be ordained, but he can preach.
Yeah.
And so I'd have loved to have been a fly on the stinky locker room wall during that debate at RPR.
I don't think there was any debate on that. You just can't do that. And RPR agreed.
Yeah. I think the general sentiment was, if he's not ordainable, then why would you license him? And I don't remember that one being particularly controversial.
No, but
Ryan,
what is interesting?
Right? You had the report up.
I do. Yes.
Was it a unanimous vote on that one? Because
it was not
flagged it. Yeah.
53-6 to 3.
Oh, yeah.
3 people abstained on that one.
So here's though, I remember that presbytery, and this is some things I voted no on that presbytery for something that didn't show up in the report, because the committee struck something that I did not want stricken, and there were 6 of us who were prepared to file a minority report, but we didn't. I don't think anybody's going to speak to it. It's not that big of a deal, but it was, these presbyteries are laying hands on men who have already been ordained. They're laying hands on them to install them, and so we caught a number of presbyteries doing that, but RPR this year said no, we don't want to find exceptions of substance for that. And so we were prepared to file a minority report. We just were not able to do it in the 7 days. And so that's not coming up. But that's why there's 6 no's on that one. They were all on the laying on the hands of installation and not an ordination. So that's what those 6 are for.
Well,
Is that a
Good debate.
I may lay hands on all of you at GA.
I'm going to get a big old hug from Brad. Every time I see Brad, I have to give him a big old awkward hug because he loves them.
All I get are side hugs.
I'll hug you next time, Resby.
Well, we'll be walking into a beautiful breakfast buffet when we do, so there will be much cause for rejoicing.
Oh, yeah. Breakfast pork, man. Breakfast pork.
All right. Well, I think we had a lot of people hang on the whole show here, and that's unbelievable. Shows that we got a weird listener base, just to go with the general weirdness of Presbyterianism. We've got that graphic. Keep Presbyterianism weird. So we're doing our part on that. Do appreciate all of you joining us. And Resby sounds awake, like he didn't nod off during this. And I'm proud of you, Resby. But you know what you got to do now.
I do. I got to sign us off. Appreciate everyone for coming on, talking about all this. I think you guys did a really benign and efficient, manageable job with the topics today. This was an annual review. You all meets expectations, with a couple moments of exceptionals, but very few fives all around. You guys got to keep working for something. Tune in next week where we'll talk about more stuff, and probably the week after that as well. If there's anything else you need, don't be a nerdman.
There is no need for fear and greed. Those are the roots of war. There is no need for fear and greed. Those are the roots of war.
What's wrong with you people?